Okay, we are on to chapter 10. And as you may recollect, in the end of chapter 9, that Katherine and Jack Frost were flying away together. And Katherine knew that Jack was hiding some dark truth, and he was hiding it for a reason. She hoped that now perhaps she would finally learn the secrets of her fair-haired boy. Chapter 10, What's Good for the Goose is Grand for the Ganderly. Kailash lifted one wing ever so slightly and banked left, gliding silently towards Katherine's island to the topmost spire of the main house. It is difficult to ascribe a structure as unique as Ganderly's as any particular sort of building. It was larger than a house, not really a mansion. It had several towers, but it wasn't a castle. It was beautiful, in some ways rather grand, but it was by no means a palace. It was rambling yet intimate. It was handsome and sturdy, but also airy and graceful. It was certainly elaborate, but in a simple, uncluttered way. There were porches and balconies and decks and walkways and roofs. Some were peaked and pitched and pointed, others were rounded or flat. But Ganderly's most notable feature was the half-dozen or so massive trees that twined and curved their way around and throughout the house itself. There were saplings of big root. Oh, these were saplings of big root. That's where her house ultimately is, her domicile, her not a palace, but grand place. These were saplings of big root, and they had the same gnarled sycamore bark of their mother tree, as well as flowing clusters of thick, elegant limbs that curled outside the windows and balconies. These limbs served as willowy paths and stairways upon which one could walk up to other windows or floors, or simply sit among the leaf tops, amid the leaf tops that arched over the house like giant leafy umbrellas. This unusual feature gave Ganderly the appearance of being a sort of treehouse estate, which had been Katherine's plan from the beginning. Oh, wait a minute. I just realized I don't have my earplug in. And no, I hope that it recorded. My voice does tend to carry. Wait a minute. I got to find my ear dealies. Huh. This unusual feature gave Ganderly the appearance of being a sort of treehouse estate, which had been Katherine's plan from the beginning. As a child, her favorite secret place had been the makeshift tree house she had made as a nest for Kailash in the topmost branches of Big Root. It was in that tree house that she began to write her many stories, where she first discovered that they had the power to help her make sense of the wonders and sorrows of the real world. Ganderly had become her grown-up version of that hideaway, the place where, as Mother Goose, she lived and thought and dreamed and wrote. But tonight, she would not write. Tonight, Jack needed a story to help him make sense of whatever it was that Ombrick had told him, and hopefully save them all. But first, he would need to wake up. Chapter 11, How to Get the Goose. Kailash settled into her gargantuan nest, nooked in the balcony outside Katherine's quarters. Jack stirred. "Did you dream?" she asked him. "Yes," he said, shaking off his sleepiness. "I had a dream of you." He said this in a way that flooded her with memories. He sounded as though he were trying not to be sad. Katherine turned and smoothed Kailash's feathers, as was her custom after a journey. Jack scratched behind Kailash's ear with the tip of his staff. One of Twiner's many powers was the soothing effect his scratch had on all great beasts. It brought indescribable peace to whoever's ear was being scratched. For the tribe of North Pole Yetis, the ear scratch was a very effective method of persuasion, especially among the full-blown giants called the Titans. These Titan Yeti roamed the outer perimeters of the North Pole, ever watchful for intruders or explorers. If anyone with evil intent neared the secret city of the North, the Titans would do what needed doing to protect it. With doers of evil, the Titans were generally merciless, but with explorers, they were more considerate. With the North Wind's help, they would fan up a blinding snowstorm to block any view of the North Pole. Sometimes the Titans would break off vast hunks of iceberg that caused explorers to float out into the Arctic Sea. Here's the power of the ear scratch with a Yeti, not Kailash, obviously. When that game grew tedious for the Titans, they fooled the next groups of explorers by creating a sort of phantom North Pole, far from the site of the actual City of Wonders. This had been Jack's idea. He knew that explorers were searching for something that was scientific, factual, magnetic, something that was at the geographical top of the world. Toys, magic, and Santa Claus are the last things on these learned gents' minds, Jack had informed the other concerned guardians. So I'll give them exactly what they're looking for and then some. He then directed the Yetis to bury a number of large meteorites, which are extremely magnetic, to establish a pretend magnetic pole. All compasses point to this pole, and have the Yetis shift the ancient ice pack under North City so that it was never anywhere near the magnetic or geographical top of the world. So that's how the North Pole that we think of as the North Pole is, it depends on whether we think of it as where Santa Claus lives. But the explorers look at the magnetic North Pole. They figure that's the real North Pole, whereas we know it's where Santa Claus lives, which is not the magnetic North Pole. Jack, however, couldn't resist yet another mischievous streak. He allowed several explorers, including the famous Admiral Robert Peary, a glimpse of the great city. He was certain that the adult world would never believe any discovery so fantastic, and indeed, he was correct. Peary and his men were laughed at by scientists for claiming to have seen a great glittering land always out of reach. Their sighting was dismissed as a mere mirage. Jack understood the limits of the adult imagination as well as he understood the open minds of children and the secret weaknesses of Yetis. While the Titan Yetis were unquestionably heroic and strong, they could sometimes be difficult to corral into action. Lifting meteors and moving cities involved a bit of enticement, so Jack would scratch behind their bed-sized ears with the crook of Twiner, and the Yeti Titans would do anything Jack asked. And so it was also with Kailash. The great goose leaned into the gentle scuffing of the staff's tip at that perfect spot between head and nape. Himalayan snow geese are notoriously aloof to those outside of their daily experience, but Kailash had always been partial to a good ear scratch and gave a sort of slow, goosey, gurgling, giggling sigh. Glancing toward a window, Jack made sure that Katherine was inside the house before he leaned close and whispered, "Is Katherine happy?" Kailash stopped her funny sigh and fluttered her eyes open. That was all Jack needed. He spoke fluent goose. The bird gurgled on, and this is what the bird shared with Jack. Katherine is not unhappy, but neither is she happy, he gleaned from the goose. But she is very bright to see Jack. Bright was a very Gooseian choice of words. Geese think in simple terms, and bright was always a good thing. Bright was like sunlight or something shiny. To geese, it meant pleased or lucky or tickled, all words that Jack liked to hear. In his long absences, he missed Katherine and worried about her, though he hated to admit it. He sometimes wished for the simpler time when he had been nightlight. When he was a nightlight, his feelings were pure and uncluttered, like those of a child. But that was more than a century ago, and there was no way to go back. He was Jack Frost now and would be forever. And what he needed this night was an answer to what Umbra could put to him. He didn't understand what had been asked of him, and he was hoping Katherine could help. Chapter 12. The greatest library the world has ever known. The number of books in Ganderley was beyond impressive. Within its many rooms, thousands of shelves pressed snugly upon one another with an ever-growing mass of volumes. Katherine's rhymes and tales, the works we call Mother Goose stories, were but a tiny fraction of her collection. As Dowager Empress of Stories, her library contained virtually every book devoted to children that had ever been. Every book devoted to children that had ever been. A lot of books. They spread throughout Ganderley in alphabetical order and far beyond Ganderley as well. Katherine functioned under many guises and disguises to establish libraries and sections of libraries that were devoted to children's books all over the world. She was aided in this endless endeavor by the citizens of a tiny nation state not far from Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, located on the Bosphorus Strait. The name of this land was Rakonturistan. The word racontur. And its people were called Rakonturks or Rakonturks. Don't know which pronunciation the author meant, Rakonturks or Rakonturks. For millennia, the rulers of Rakonturistan had been chosen not by birth or by lineage or by who was most cunning or adept at war, but by the beauty, wit, and power of the stories they told. Theirs was a nation of the imagination with a history that mixed fact and fiction with joyful abandon. Entire eras and epical events may or may not have happened. If the myth sounded good and was entertaining, then it was proclaimed to be true. The only rule the Rakonturks insisted upon was that no fiction could be used to hurt any real person, and most important, anyone who was overly cruel or mean would be banished. The Rakonturks' history had many villains, none of them actual, and an endless series of heroes who may or may not have existed. So when the Rakonturks became aware of Katherine, or rather Mother Goose, they felt as if the most wonderful story of all had at last come true, and they called her Lady Goose. And here's one of the Rakonturks. The Rakonturks volunteered to be Katherine's secret army and proved themselves to be invaluable as unofficial diplomats in the service of spreading the most important of stories. In every town, village, city, and hamlet, they posed as teachers, professors, and scholars, but most often librarians, devoting their lives to inspiring people, especially children, to not only read, but also to write. In time, the notion of growing up and becoming a writer began to take hold as a genuine possibility for thousands of imaginative people. And this was the beginning of one of the most powerful and important forces of the Guardian, an actual protective field that encircled the entire Earth. Wonderful stories encircling the entire Earth. The man in the moon called it the mythosphere, and from it coursed an invisible layer of enchantment that could inspire any man, woman, or child who needed or desired to tell a story. This had been Katherine's inspiration. She had discovered during her childhood with Umbridge that stories could save people. They had helped her save North when he nearly died of his wounds protecting the children of Santov Clausen. And they had saved her, transforming her from a shy, lonely, and seemingly powerless orphan into a being who, even as a child, could stand toe-to-toe with the most potent village in the cosmos, Pitch himself. Pitch was keenly aware of Katherine's growing influence. He had always known that Katherine would develop into a formidable entity. That had been the primary reason why he had tried to convert her into becoming his darkling princess, why he had submerged her into that dark sleep when she had resisted, the sleep that Nightlight had woken her from with that single kiss. And now, even in his deep isolation, Pitch felt the shift in Katherine's growing powers. But this new component of the Guardian's defenses, these ever-amassing stories, struck some deep and fearful alarm inside his dark heart. Spells, magic, jolliness, chocolate eggs, presents, elves, teeth. All the Guardian's methods to fight his darkness were to him puny parlor tricks. This power of story, he could not figure out how to fight a story. A cow jumps over the moon. A boy named Huck saves his friend, he would rant to himself. Things that never actually happened, and yet they matter. They move people, make them care. They give them escape. They give them hope. They make them less afraid. And he simmered with rage of the ignorant. How do I fight something that isn't real? For more than a century, he'd puzzled over this. As with most mysteries, when the solution came, it was simple. The clean, elegant cruelty of the scheme he was devising became vital to him, delighted him. He lay in his prison, concocting his own story, a story of revenge. And this story had indeed saved him in a way, changed him, made him even craftier. This plan gave him new life and purpose. For the first time, he understood the power he was fighting. But his story would not be used to help her heal. This story was everything that Rakan Turks fought against. This story would cause hurt. It would destroy. Chapter 13, in which we get to the root of the matter. Jack Frost's many homes were scattered evenly across Earth, all of them inside the hollows of large trees. Each was the offspring of Big Root, and these children of Big Root were often the oldest tree in the forest where they grew. They had all been planted soon after Bright Night by Twiner. Twiner himself came from a willow called Warrior's Willow, which stood on ancient Viking burial grounds. From its branches, Viking warriors and hunters fashioned the strongest and most flexible bows, staffs, and arrows. The warrior dead were buried among the willow's roots, and each limb was said to have the spirit of a warrior within. Spirit of a warrior within its heartwood. This spirit could help the person who wielded it, but only if that person were brave and true of heart. Jack's staff was his friend, his comrade, his protector. It would alert him to danger. It could focus Jack's power to speak to the wind and learn the language of leaves. There's Jack down there. There's the warrior tree. On this particular day in a forest near the Isle of Ganderley, the trees saw something that worried them. Two men were making their way toward Mother Goose's home. The trees of many lands had been watching these two since they had begun their journey in the jungle of Punjab High-Low. But the trees had waited to send out warning to any guardian until they felt a genuine threat. These two men traveled by car or train or boat when necessary, but they preferred to travel by trees swinging from branch to branch when possible. Thus, the trees discovered what these men had once been and now knew they meant ill. They knew that Piner must be sent an urgent message. The message is, an old enemy is near. Chapter 14, Anger Management. Oddly enough, the Raconturks were fiercely effective guards of Ganderley. Being well read, they had studied every kind of close quarters combat and had made up several of their own, all of them derivations of ninja, kung fu, Shaolin, and classic fisticuffs, incorporating sabers, swords, clubs, and even a method of using books as shields or like boomerangs. Most impressively, they had also contrived a method of using invented words that, when spoken at the proper volume and inflection, could completely incapacitate any foe. These words, kind of like another tale. These words were called onomatopoeia, and they were most impressive in sound and effect. Whap, pow, shing, splat, ping, bunk, crack, twang, or bloom, or splat, or blam, or wang. These words have been designed and tested for their power by the Mows, M-O-W-S, the mystic order of the words, these, or mystic order of the word smiths. Smithies, the wordsmiths. Who were a much respected fraternal maternal group within the Raconturks. Members of the Mows, mystic order of the wordsmiths, made up the majority of Ganderley's guards. The Mows were on high alert with the arrival of Jack Frost to Ganderley. It had been a long time since there had been a visit from the Jack, as they called him, and his arrival always brought an air of excitement and expectation. Jack was a great warrior and a kindred spirit. They admired him, and on those rare occasions when he visited, they were especially watchful, not only because Jack had about him an air of cheerful danger and had many enemies, but he was also known to trick them with humorous pretend attacks and other mischief. Jack, however, was not in a mischievous frame of mind right now. He was quiet and intent. As Katherine led him to the deep inner chamber of Ganderley, where the histories of the guardians were kept, he barely glanced at the pair of guards who flanked the heavy bookshelf-covered doors. The guards sensed that this visit was different. As they stood at attention, they discreetly peered inside the room, watching as Jack leaned Twiner against a wall of books. As the doors began to shut, the guards saw a large book fly down from the stacks. Their lady raised her arm and the book landed lightly on her wrist like a bird. They knew this volume well. It was the most important book in their lady's collection. It was Mr. QWERTY, the living book of all knowledge. Mr. QWERTY
had once been a bookworm of some note in Ombrick's incomparable library. Pitch had once planned to steal Ombrick's many volumes, and to thwart him, this valiant worm had consumed the entire collection, all of Ombrick's books. He actually ate every page of each individual book. This Herculean effort had kept Pitch from amassing the vast knowledge of the ages, including the great secrets of the lost civilization of Atlantis, all of which he intended to use for evil. He had intended to use for evil. For Mr. QWERTY, there were profound side effects. He immediately built his cocoon and emerged weeks later as a sort of butterfly book, whose many wings were pages that could display the writings on any particular subject he had consumed. And Mr. QWERTY kept current. Mr. QWERTY. Katherine fed him copies of every book written since his remarkable evolution, while making sure that he gobbled up a steady diet of all the Guardians' histories and adventures. So QWERTY, a former worm, became in effect the most important book in the history of knowledge and literature. Now Mr. QWERTY looked at them expectantly. Katherine was equally curious. In fact, she was near shivering in anticipation. Jack had wanted a story. They were among them all. Which would he choose? She turned to Jack. His eyes were bright. What story do you want to hear? Katherine asked. One of mine, he said immediately. Looking to the bookworm on her arm, Katherine said, Mr. QWERTY, if you please, turn to the stories and adventures of the being called Nightlight, now known as Jackson Overland Frost. Mr. QWERTY's pages fluttered. The anticipated text appeared, and Katherine looked back at Jack. Then she asked the question that had been on her mind since Ombrick had appeared to them earlier at the North Pole. Is it a story that Ombrick asked you about? Jack didn't answer immediately. He generally enjoyed being cleverly teasing in his conversations, but with Katherine, he was usually more direct and honest. Honesty is harder than being clever, and it often takes longer, too. Honesty is harder than being clever, and it often takes longer, too. As Katherine waited, she felt the entirety of their long relationship pass by in a matter of a dozen sated seconds. She was aging backward, growing younger. So was Jack, till they became the age they were when they had shared that single kiss. Isn't that wonderful? This magic shift always startled them. They felt so young and yet so old. I'm not sure what he wants of me, Katherine, Jack said, starting to pace. Katherine understood why he wasn't sure. Ombrick, like all good wizards, would seldom answer an important question directly. Instead, he would usually tell you just enough so that you could, after thinking through the situation, find the answer for yourself. All he said, Jack added with a knowing grin, aging himself from 12 to 16, was, remember. Remember? Remember. Katherine shook her head with exasperation. The world is in chaos, and we ask for guidance, and all Father Time will allow us is one word? Yep, said Jack, though it does have 3 syllables. Mr. QWERTY snickered at that. Katherine pursed her lips and tried to stay calm, but she glowed with irritation. She sometimes grew impatient with the figure-it-out-yourself logic of wizards. Can't I, for once, get a straight answer to a simple question, she fumed. A simple yes or no, or here's what you do, would save so much time. Jack watched her bemused. He had always admired her temper and her ability to control it, or at least channel it into constructive action. Her fury could be prodigious at times, but she used it well and to great effect, like Zeus hurling thunderbolts. He honestly could not remember her ever completely losing her temper. That said, memory had become a most curious element of his life since becoming Jack Frost. He found that he could erase the memory of entire sections of his life if he chose, and he often did. Katherine, however, disliked this ability of his, and she made no secret of it, for she now knew his life better than he did, which felt wrong to her. How will he ever be a real person or a whole person if he simply erases the bad? She often wondered. She turned her fierce gaze to Jack. So what exactly am I supposed to remember? She said this less as a question than an accusation, and her irritation began to transform her back into Mother Goose. As she grew older, taller, Jack had to fight the urge to run and hide like a child. And as she grew older, taller, he actually began to grow younger. I don't know, he said, as he became 1 year younger. I see, she said curtly. He became 1 year younger still. After an uncomfortable silence, he made a suggestion he knew would irritate her even further. Katherine, he shrank another year. I trust you. Another year vanished to know best. He'd reached bottom. He could be shamed into growing no younger, and she could appear no older. He was back to 12, and she was 25. There was a limit to how young he could transform, and he had reached it. He sat on the floor in front of the fireplace, his legs crossed, his back slumped, his head hung low. I can't wait to forget this, he remarked. Katherine sighed. Though they were inches apart, the distance between them felt vast. She wished she could forget this too, but she knew that was not the nature of things, at least for her. For all the dash and glamour that being Jack Frost implied, Katherine knew the price he paid for his eternal youth. He had defeated Pitch more decisively than all the other guardians combined, and he had done so with a selflessness and courage that had surprised even the man in the moon. Now, yet again, the balance of the earth's happiness or misery rested on his slender shoulders. It was in truth a terrible burden, one that no other guardian had ever carried. And they sometimes forgot this, as adults often do. They forget how strong, how brave a child must be to live in the world of grown-ups. But Jack could never forget, for he was forever young. This is what set him apart from the other guardians. It set him apart from every other being in the world. Katherine sank to her knees in front of Jack. Mr. QWERTY fluttered and hovered above her as she smoothed the dark velvet skirt that she wore in winter. She looked to Jack. His gaze seemed far away, as if looking at a night sky void of stars. He's making his mind blank, she realized, and ready for what he will hear. So she shifted her gaze to Mr. QWERTY and nodded. The book came to rest in her lap. It was still open to the same page, the beginning of Jack's story. Katherine traced her fingers lightly over the paper as if feeling the words written upon. The whole of Jack's life played out in her thoughts while the pages of Mr. QWERTY turned, grazing her fingertips as if blown by an unhurried wind. Back and forth like cards in a shuffling deck, the pages fluttered, going forward and backward in Jack's history. So many adventures. so much joy and exhilaration, and sometimes so much loneliness and sorrow. Jack's life was literally in her hands. Which story does he need to hear to remember? What happened in his past that can help him, help us all to steady these dark days? Katherine focused every avenue of her mind on this single question. The pages riffled past her fingertips, faster still, until a turbulent breeze began to roil about the room. Twiner began to rattle and shake against the wall, and then the atmosphere intensified. A noticeable charge filled the air. It was the other guardians. They had felt Catherine's concentration, and as they had so many times before, their minds joined North, Tuthiana, Bunnymund, Sandy, then the man in the moon himself, even Mother Nature. Even Mother Nature became part of the effort. From each of their headquarters on the moon and across the earth, their minds searched and probed Jack's history until the pages of Mr. Cordy became a blur too fast to measure, and the wind in the room grew to almost a gale. The fire in the hearth flickered and dimmed as it struggled to stay lit. Twiner was pulled into the maelstrom, caught in the whipping winds, but Jack seemed fully nonplussed. He extended one arm and snatched the staff down with a single effortless grab. Then Katherine began to transform once more. Her features blended and smooth. Years dissolved. The wind slowed. She again became the Katherine of her time with Nightlight. The pages eased their shuffling and stopped at last. The mystery would unfold now, and each of them would be privy to its discovery. But there was one more who would hear, one who was not meant to. Deep under the earth, the impossible occurred. In his prison, Pitch, king of nightmares, was listening to every utterance and syllable of the one story that could help him destroy the Guardians forever. And this eavesdropping was known only to Pitch. Or was it? Or was it? Her girlish voice steady and clear, Katherine began to read from the history of Jack Frost. The story of the kiss. During the War of Dreams, before the Battle of Bright Night, Pitch had imprisoned Katherine on Nightmare Rock, the ancient stone that had once been his prison and was permeated to its core with all of Pitch's rage and hate. The rage had surrounded Katherine and created a shield that would keep anyone from ever awakening her. He cast her into an endless sleep of nightmares with the hope that he would darken her soul, turn her to evil. Then he would make her his darkling daughter, his princess of nightmares. But Nightlight and the Sandman found the cave where Pitch had entombed Katherine. They stole away the wretched rock, and with Sandy's dream sand levitated it to the North Pole, and there they and the other guardians would try to break the nightmare spell and free Katherine. But the rock was dense with countless nightmare men. As Sandy and Nightlight floated over the pole, the nightmares began to charge. The nightmares began to charge. Ooh. The stone and attack. All had seemed lost. All had seemed lost. Then Nightlight remembered the power of the goodnight kiss. He remembered that the man in the moon's parents would kiss the baby man in the moon good night every night. He remembered that this kiss would take away all the hurt of the day. Nightlight then thought his most unknight-like thought. He knew a kiss was a powerful thing, a thing of hope. And he knew that he was a creature of unending hope. So his kiss must have great power. And he also knew something no nightlight had ever known, that he loved. He loved his Katherine more than anything in all the universe. And though he did not even know how to give a kiss, he closed his eyes and lunged face forward toward Katherine. The nightmare shield gave way like vapor, and for an eternal instant, Nightlight's lips touched Katherine's, and all Pitch's dark spells withered away. Her eyes opened, and Nightlight took her hand, and together they flew to safety. Nightmare Rock fell and landed harmlessly just beside the North Pole. The whole of the great city cheered and celebrated Katherine's rescue, and Nightlight was proclaimed a hero. The Sandman was made a guardian, and there was no sign of Pitch, the Nightmare King. That night, after much merrymaking and ballyhoo, Nightlight and Katherine fell asleep in the topmost room of the pole. For Nightlight, it was a miraculous sleep, for he had never before slept. No Nightlight ever had. Nightlight was exactly what he was called, a light against the night. But now he was changed. The kiss had changed him forever. The kiss had changed him forever. And though he had protected dreams for his entire life, he had never had one. That night he dreamt. But Pitch did not. He had in fact tricked them all. He knew that North's magnificent tower was also a ship, a craft that could journey to the moon. The North Pole, as it was called, was the tallest structure in the city. Its outward appearance was that of a curious sort of tower, but at its base were a number of engines that enabled the pole to rocket outside the Earth's atmosphere. North had intended his new craft to act as a sort of space shuttle to the moon and back, the hope being that constant travel to the moon would be not only jolly and inspiring, but also forge a closer bond with the man in the moon. So what's Pitch's trick? Ever since his grounding on Earth, Pitch had never been powerful enough to leave it. This craft, this North Pole, was exactly what Pitch needed to complete his plan to destroy Nightlight. With the Guardians helplessly stranded on Earth, Pitch could extinguish Nightlight, conquer the moon, and use it as his base to once again terrorize the galaxies. So he had hidden himself inside Nightmare Rock. He had successfully anticipated that the Guardians would bring the rock to the North Pole in an effort to save Katherine. He let them think they had defeated the Nightmare Men and rescued her. The next step in his plan was to kidnap Nightlight and fly the pole to the moon. But luckily for Pitch, Nightlight was already asleep in the pole, as was Katherine. Once the city had gone quiet, Pitch crept from the rock, digging it into the pole. He then found the control room and piloted the craft across the sea of space toward the moon. As Pitch neared Man in the Moon's home, he used Nightmare Rock once more. Passing over the moon's dark side, he launched the stone like a meteor and rode it as it fell. It crashed in the deepest crater on the darkest part of the moon's shadowlands, and with it, Pitch began to build his new Nightmare Me. Nightlight and Katherine knew nothing of all this intrigue. They slept, and when the pole landed, they awoke. They were greeted by Man in the Moon himself, and there was much excitement and concern. Man in the Moon knew that something extraordinary had happened to Nightlight and Katherine. He also knew that Pitch must be planning a terrible revenge. Katherine stopped her reading and glanced at Jack. He still sat cross-legged, staring into the fire. Held his staff in one hand. He still sat cross-legged, staring into the fire. He held his staff in one hand, balancing its base on the floor. The diamond dagger tucked into his waistband glinted. Katherine's eyes narrowed. Jack had carried a diamond dagger in the old days, but this one was different. It was dark, seemed strange. She waited to see if Jack wanted her to read on. The next section of the story she had penned herself. It was from the sketchbook diary she'd kept in those long ago days. But she'd always been uncomfortable reading her own prose aloud, so she was hesitant to continue, especially now that it was about Jack and he was the one who was listening. Finally, he nodded to her. "Your voice always soothes me, Katherine," he said, as if reading her mind, which was quite likely. She thought how much he had changed since she'd written the entry she was about to read. He spoke with such elegance and confidence now, with only an occasional trace of the simple syntax of his night-light years. She slipped back into the cadences of a born storyteller and began to read. If only she had known about the danger that was making its stealthy way across the grounds of the Isle of Ganderley. Jack seemed to be listening intently as she began. What she hadn't noticed was that he had moved his free hand down to the hilt of his diamond dagger and was gripping it with all his might. And I think we shall pause there because what comes next is really. This is Moon Days from the Journal of Katherine while on the moon. Oh, this story gets so deep. Till the next time.